When she said, "If you even think about divorce, you'll never see our kids again," I knew she'd crossed a line. But instead of yelling, I just nodded and replied, "Fine. This wasn't a promise. It was a decision, and it would change everything." She didn't know what I meant, and if I'm being honest with you, I wasn't sure either. Not at first. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let her win this game. Not like that. See, Sarah always loved control. I used to admire that about her. The way she could handle work, the house, the kids, everything like clockwork. But over the years, that same need for control started poisoning us. It was like being married to someone who thought life was chess, and every piece, me included, was hers to move. So, when she hit me with that line, it wasn't the threat that stuck with me. It was the coldness. The way she stared, daring me to push back. I remember sitting there, silent, while my mind started working like it hadn't in years. I wasn't angry, not even hurt, just calm. Too calm, maybe. And in that calm, I made a decision. She thought she was calling the shots. But she was about to find out what happens when you play games with someone who's been watching your every move. It started like most evenings. I'd just gotten home from the gym, feeling that satisfying kind of exhaustion you only get after pushing yourself hard. The kids were already tucked in. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. And Sarah was sitting at the dining room table with a half-empty glass of wine. She had that look on her face. You know the one I'm talking about. The one that says, "We need to talk, but I'm going to pretend this is casual so you don't see it coming." I grabbed a water bottle from the fridge and leaned against the counter, watching her. "Rough day?" I asked. She shook her head, giving me this small, distracted smile. "Not really. Just been thinking a lot." I didn't press her. Not right away. Sarah was always the type to get straight to the point eventually, but she liked to set the stage first. I twisted the cap off my bottle and took a long drink, waiting. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "John, can we be honest with each other for a minute?" That caught me off guard. We'd been married for over a decade. There wasn't much room for dishonesty in a house where you share bathrooms, bills, and 2 screaming kids. "Always," I said, even though I had a feeling I wasn't going to like where this was headed. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I feel like we've been stuck, like we're just going through the motions. Does it feel like that to you?" I tilted my head. "What do you mean, stuck? We've got 2 young kids, careers, a mortgage. It's not exactly date night central, but that's life, right?" She shook her head, frustration flashing in her eyes. "That's not what I mean. I'm talking about us. The spark, the passion. It's not there anymore. We're like roommates, John. Don't you feel it? Now look, I'm not blind. I knew things had been quieter between us lately, but I figured that's what happens when you've been married this long. It's not all fireworks and roses after 10 years of kids puking on you at 3 a.m. and juggling a million responsibilities." "All right," I said cautiously. "You think we're stuck. What do you want to do about it?" Her eyes lit up, like she'd been waiting for me to ask that exact question. "I've been reading about something," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "A way to bring excitement back into a marriage. It's not traditional, but it works for some couples." I stayed silent, letting her get to the point. She took a deep breath and said, "What if we tried an open marriage?" I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the last thing I expected to come out of her mouth. "An open marriage?" I repeated, just to make sure I wasn't hearing things. "Yes," she said quickly, like she was afraid I'd shut it down before she could explain. "Think about it, John. We'd set rules, boundaries. It's not about replacing each other. It's about exploring what we've lost." I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. "And what if I'm not on board with this experiment?" That's when her tone shifted. The sweetness in her voice disappeared, and she sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Then we divorce," she said, her words cold and sharp. "And if we go down that road, you'll never see the kids again." The air in the room changed. My stomach tightened, but I didn't show it. You learn a lot about someone when they play their trump card too early. I walked over to the table and sat down across from her, keeping my expression calm. Let me get this straight. You're saying I can either agree to share you, or you'll take the kids and walk away. Her gaze didn't waver. I'm saying this is what we need, John. It's a way to save what we have. But if you're not willing to even try, then maybe we don't have anything worth saving. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, but instead of reacting, I leaned back in my chair and nodded slowly. All right, I said after a long pause. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. All right, you're okay with this. If this is what you think will fix things, then sure, I said, keeping my tone casual. Let's try it. I could see her relax, like she thought she'd won. She even reached for her glass of wine, smiling faintly as she took a sip. But here's the thing. I wasn't agreeing because I believed in her plan. I wasn't agreeing because I was weak, or because I thought I'd actually enjoy sharing my wife. No, I agreed because I wanted to see just how far she was willing to go. And, more importantly, I wanted her to see what it felt like to lose control. She thought she was setting the rules of the game, but she didn't realize she'd just handed me the board. It didn't take long for Sarah to dive headfirst into her newfound freedom. Barely a week after our little conversation, she started coming home later than usual. At first, she'd offer excuses. A late meeting, drinks with colleagues. But by the second week, the mask was off. She wasn't even pretending anymore. One Friday evening, she came downstairs dressed like she was 25 again. Tight black dress, heels that I didn't even know she owned. She paused in the doorway, tilting her head like she wanted me to notice. "Don't wait up," she said casually, grabbing her purse. I didn't look up from the TV. "Big plans." She smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Just dinner. Part of the whole open marriage thing." She gave me a pointed look, like she was daring me to react. "You should consider finding someone too. It's only fair, right?" Fair. That word hung in the air long after she walked out the door. Fair, as if any of this was about fairness. But I didn't say a word. I just sat there, listening to the sound of her heels clicking down the driveway, followed by the low rumble of the car engine fading into the night. That first time, I didn't ask where she was going. I didn't check her phone or wait up for her like some lovesick teenager. I went to bed at my usual time, woke up early, and hit the gym like I always did. When she stumbled back home the next morning looking tired and smug, I just nodded at her on my way out the door. By the third date, she stopped bothering to hide it. She'd text me vague updates like, "Won't be home for dinner. Don't wait up," as if I cared. And every time she walked out the door, she left with this little flick of her hair, like she thought she was winning. But here's the thing about games. They only work if both players are playing by the same rules. One night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she sighed dramatically. "You really should find someone, John. I mean, isn't that the whole point of this?" I looked at her for a long moment, my face unreadable. Maybe I'm taking my time. Quality over quantity, right? That shut her up for a while, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She thought I was passive, too slow to keep up with her. That's the thing about Sarah. She was always so sure she was 10 steps ahead. But she didn't realize I wasn't even playing the same game. While she was busy juggling her little fling, I was watching, waiting, and working on something she'd never see coming. One night, I overheard her on the phone. She was speaking in a soft, flirty voice I hadn't heard in years. I didn't have to guess who she was talking to. His name was Greg, or maybe it was Garrett. I didn't bother remembering because honestly he wasn't the point. The point was Sarah thought she had all the power. She'd come home after these dates, throwing little jabs my way like, "It's funny how much more alive I feel lately," or, "I forgot how good it feels to be seen," as if her self-discovery was something I should applaud. But I stayed quiet. I let her think she was in control because patience is a weapon most people underestimate. She wanted a game? Fine. I play. But the difference was I wasn't playing to win. I was playing to end it. On my terms. It all started at one of Sarah's family gatherings, her mom's birthday, if I remember right. These events were always a show. Everyone pretending to be one big happy family, even though half the room had grudges that went back decades. I used to grin and bear it for Sarah's sake. But this time, I went because I had nothing better to do. Sarah showed up late, of course. She waltzed in halfway through dinner, laughing too loud and clinging to her excuse of a business colleague. She didn't even bother introducing him, just waved vaguely in his direction and said, "Work friend. No big deal." It wasn't the first time she'd flaunted her new lifestyle, but I wasn't about to let her ruin my evening. So, I grabbed a beer, found a corner, and kept to myself. That's when Alice walked over. Now, Alice and I had always been friendly, but there was this unspoken distance between us. She was Sarah's older sister, smart, sharp-tongued, and, frankly, too perceptive for her own good. She wasn't the type to sugarcoat things, which is probably why Sarah never liked her much. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," Alice said, leaning against the wall next to me. I gave her a half-smile. "That obvious?" She glanced across the room where Sarah was laughing too loud at something her friend said. "Let me guess. She brought him here just to get under your skin?" I shrugged. "Probably." Alice raised an eyebrow. "And you're just okay with that?" I took a sip of my beer, keeping my voice calm. "Let's just say I'm playing the long game." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, like she understood more than I was saying. "You're a better man than me," she said, laughing lightly. "If it were me, I'd have burned this whole circus down by now." That was the first time in a long time I'd felt like someone saw me. Not as the problem, not as the guy Sarah could walk all over, but as me. We talked for the rest of the night. At first, it was casual, complaining about family drama, cracking jokes about Sarah's latest antics. But then the conversation shifted. Alice started asking real questions. "How are you holding up through all this?" she asked, her tone softer. I paused, unsure how to answer. "Honestly, it's not easy, but I've learned to pick my battles." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when Sarah first mentioned this open marriage thing, I thought she was joking. But now," she trailed off, shaking her head, "I just don't get it. You're a good guy, John. You deserve better than this mess." That hit me harder than I expected. Maybe it was because I hadn't heard anything like that in years. Not from Sarah. Not from anyone. After that night, Alice and I started talking more. At first, it was innocent. Texting about the kids, sharing updates about Sarah's increasingly reckless behavior. But the more we talked, the more I realized how easy it was to be around her. She got it. She understood how hard I was trying to hold everything together, and she didn't judge me for it. In fact, she respected it. One afternoon, she invited me out for coffee, just to talk. I went, thinking it'd be a quick catch-up, but we ended up sitting there for hours. She told me about her failed relationships, her regrets, and her frustrations with Sarah. I told her about the loneliness, the quiet resentment, and the way Sarah had turned my world upside down. "It's not fair," Alice said at one point, her voice low. "You've been nothing but loyal to her, and she's treating you like this? It's disgusting." "It is what it is," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Alice shook her head, her eyes meeting mine.
"No, John.
"It's not. You deserve better." That was the moment everything changed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I'd even considered before. But sitting there, looking at Alice, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen. It began as friendship, sure. But the more time we spent together, the harder it was to ignore the connection. Alice wasn't just Sarah's older sister anymore. She was someone who understood me, someone who cared. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live again. What started as coffee dates and late-night conversations quickly became something more. Alice and I didn't label it at first, but we both knew what was happening. She was careful, almost hesitant, like she was testing the waters. But the connection we had, it was undeniable. Alice opened up about things I never knew, how Sarah had always been controlling, even as kids. She always had to be the center of attention, Alice said one evening. And God forbid someone got in her way. She'd tear them apart. Hearing that made me realize that Sarah's behavior wasn't a sudden shift. It was who she'd always been. I just hadn't seen it clearly until now. We decided to keep things quiet for the time being, not wanting to blow things up too soon. But we weren't exactly subtle. At the next family gathering, Sarah caught me and Alice talking in the corner, laughing about something that had nothing to do with her. "Something funny?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp, her eyes flicking between us. "Just a little family story," Alice said smoothly, giving me a knowing look. Sarah didn't say anything, but the way she stared at us, I knew she was starting to piece things together. Secrets like ours don't stay hidden forever. The question wasn't if Sarah would find out. It was when. It didn't take long for Sarah to notice the changes in me. I wasn't walking around angry or defeated anymore. I wasn't waiting up for her late at night or asking questions about her so-called dates. I had my own plans now, and that shift in energy didn't go unnoticed. Started small. One morning, I was getting ready for work, whistling a tune that had been stuck in my head. Sarah walked into the bathroom, toothbrush in hand, and paused in the doorway, watching me with narrowed eyes. "You're in a good mood," she said, her tone laced with suspicion. "Guess I am," I replied, adjusting my tie in the mirror. She didn't say anything, just studied me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Over the next few weeks, my newfound calm and confidence seemed to drive her crazy. I was hitting the gym more, coming home later, and even updating my wardrobe. A small change, but one I knew she'd notice. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, Sarah plopped down on the couch across from me. She had that look on her face, the one she always wore when she thought she was about to catch someone in a lie. "Did you meet someone?" she asked bluntly, her voice carefully neutral. I looked up from my book and smiled, just enough to keep her guessing. "Maybe," I said lightly, turning a page. "Isn't that part of our agreement?" She stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "You're awfully casual about it." I shrugged. "You're the one who wanted this, Sarah. I'm just following the rules." Her jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "Well, I'm glad you're finally putting yourself out there." I could see the frustration brewing beneath her calm exterior. She hated not knowing. Sarah had always been the one in control, the one who dictated how things went. But now she was on the outside looking in, and it was killing her. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with a look of quiet intensity. I didn't have to ask what she was doing. I knew she was trying to figure me out, checking my social media, maybe even considering going through my phone. She thought she'd get to me first, but I'd learned how to stay one step ahead. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in years, I was the one holding the cards. She wanted freedom, but she hadn't expected me to use it better than her. And the more she tried to regain control, the more it slipped through her fingers. It was a Saturday evening, and Sarah's family had thrown one of their classic backyard parties. An excuse for everyone to drink too much, gossip too loudly, and pretend they liked each other. I wasn't particularly excited to go, but Alice was. "Just stick with me," she had whispered when we arrived, her hand brushing mine ever so slightly. "It'll be fun to watch the show." And she wasn't wrong. Watching Sarah parade around, laughing at nothing and pretending she was living her best life, was a performance worthy of an award. Her date that night was yet another nameless friend. A guy who looked like he spent more time in front of a mirror than Sarah did. Alice and I stayed on the sidelines, chatting quietly by the food table, but even from a distance, I could see Sarah stealing glances at us. Her smile was tight, her laughter forced. "You know she's watching us, right?" Alice murmured, her lips curving into a sly smile. "Let her," I replied, my tone calm. She wanted this. The more we talked, the closer we got, close enough that anyone paying attention could see the chemistry. Alice had this way of leaning in when she laughed, her hand lightly brushing my arm. It wasn't deliberate, but it was real, and that was enough to make Sarah snap. I didn't see her approach until she was right there, standing between us, her eyes burning with fury. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise around us. I glanced at her, keeping my expression calm. What does it look like? I'm having a conversation. With her. Sarah shot back, her voice rising. That's my sister, John. Alice took a small step back, but I stayed where I was, meeting Sarah's glare head-on. And? You wanted an open relationship, I said, my tone even, almost amused. I'm just playing by the rules. Her face flushed deep red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually cause a scene. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to Alice, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You're disgusting. Do you even care what this is doing to our family? Alice didn't flinch. I'm not the one who started this, Sarah. Maybe you should think about that. Sarah's jaw clenched, and without another word, she stormed off toward her date, leaving us standing there. I watched her go, calm as ever. That was bold, Alice said, a trace of nervousness in her voice. She'll get over it, I replied, my gaze following Sarah as she angrily grabbed another drink. This is just the beginning. And it was. Her anger at the party? That was just the first crack in her carefully crafted control. I was ready for much, much more. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread through Sarah's family. What started as side glances and murmurs at the party snowballed into outright conversations. By the following weekend, everyone knew. John and Alice were more than just friendly. At first, I expected backlash. I mean, who wouldn't? I was still technically Sarah's husband, and Alice was her sister. But to my surprise, most of the family didn't see me as the bad guy. She brought this on herself, Sarah's cousin Claire said during one of the endless phone calls I overheard. What did she expect? Throwing her marriage away like that? Even Sarah's parents, who usually tiptoed around confrontation, seemed to side with me. John's been nothing but good to her, her mom told Alice when she visited one afternoon. And honestly, Sarah's been acting selfish for years. It's about time someone called her out. Of course, Sarah didn't take any of this lying down. She went into full damage control mode, twisting the story to make herself the victim. Can you believe what Alice is doing to me? She complained to anyone who would listen. She's ruining our family. But the more she tried to spin it, the more people started to see through her. It didn't help that her dates kept showing up to family events or that she talked about her freedom like it was some kind of prize. Then one night she cornered Alice. It was at another family dinner, awkward as hell for everyone involved. Sarah waited until most of the family was distracted in the living room, then pulled Alice into the kitchen. I stayed in the hallway, close enough to hear every word. You need to stop this, Sarah said, her voice low but trembling with anger. You're destroying everything. Alice didn't back down. Destroying what, Sarah? The marriage you already threw away? The family you're constantly embarrassing? Don't blame me for the mess you made. You're my sister, Sarah snapped, her voice rising. How can you do this to me? Alice's response was calm but sharp. I'm doing this for me. For once, I'm not letting you dictate how things go. And honestly, John deserves better than what you've put him through. I could practically hear Sarah's teeth grinding from where I stood. You think this is love? He's just using you to get back at me. Alice didn't miss a beat. Maybe you should have thought about that before you gave him a reason to. Sarah stormed out of the kitchen, her face flushed with fury. She didn't say a word to anyone else for the rest of the night, but I could see the cracks forming. The family had shifted. Her attempts to control the narrative weren't working, and she knew it. Sarah had always been the one pulling the strings. Now she was the one unraveling, and it was driving her crazy. It was a strange shift. After weeks of flaunting her new life and acting like she'd won, Sarah suddenly started trying. One night, out of nowhere, she cooked dinner. And not the usual quick, half-hearted meal, but a full spread, candles on the table, soft music playing in the background. I walked in from the gym, towel still around my neck, and immediately felt the awkward tension in the air. What's all this? I asked, setting my bag down. Sarah stepped out of the kitchen, wearing a dress I hadn't seen in years. I thought we could have dinner. Just the two of us. I looked at the table, then back at her. Since when are we doing this? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We used to do things like this all the time. Don't you miss it? I shrugged. We haven't done this in years, Sarah. Why start now? Her smile faltered, but she pressed on. I've been thinking, maybe we could try to reconnect. Just us.
No distractions.
I didn't have to ask what she meant by distractions. She wasn't subtle. But I played along, sitting down at the table and letting her talk. The whole night, she was overly sweet, reminiscing about the good old days and how things used to be. She even reached out to touch my hand, her fingers lingering longer than they needed to. Later, as I stood by the sink rinsing my plate, she came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. It was so forced, so out of character, that I almost laughed. John, she whispered, her voice low. Maybe we could. She let the sentence trail off, her meaning clear. I stepped away, turning to face her. What are you doing, Sarah? She looked up at me, her expression desperate. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying to fix this. I shook my head, keeping my tone calm but firm. Fix it? You wanted us apart, remember? But it seems we've only grown closer. Just not in the way you imagined. Her face crumbled. For the first time, I saw something real. Fear. Not anger, not control, but fear. She didn't say anything, just stared at me as I walked upstairs, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. That was the moment I realized she was spiraling. The next few days, her desperation became impossible to ignore. She stopped going out, started pacing the house, snapping at the kids over nothing. She spent hours on her phone, probably trying to figure out what was going on between Alice and me. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. She realized her mistake. But it was too late. A week later, Sarah finally broke. I came home to find her sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. She didn't even look up as I walked in. Normally, she'd throw out some snarky comment or ask why I was late. Not this time. Everything okay? I asked, even though I knew the answer. She looked up, her eyes red and puffy. John? Can we talk? I sighed, setting my keys down. Sure. What's on your mind? She gestured to the couch across from her, waiting until I sat down before she spoke. I can't do this anymore. The dates, the games, the fighting. It's tearing everything apart. I leaned back, watching her. Isn't this what you wanted? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know it would feel like this. I thought it would make us better, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. She leaned forward, gripping her hands together. Let's forget all of this. Let's end this madness and go back to how it was. Please, John. For the kids. For us. Her voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment, I just stared at her. I could see the regret written all over her face, but it didn't move me. Not anymore. Why now, Sarah? I asked coldly. Why are you only saying this now? Isn't this what you wanted? She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She looked defeated, like she finally understood the depth of what she'd done. But there was one thing she didn't know, one thing I hadn't told her yet. The moment was coming, and when it did, she wouldn't just feel regret. She'd feel the weight of every decision she'd made. When I told Sarah we should host a family dinner, she was suspicious at first. Why now? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Because it's been a while since everyone's been together, I said casually. The kids miss their grandparents, and it'll be nice to have a normal evening for a change. She hesitated but eventually agreed. Of course, I made sure Alice was invited. The evening started as these dinners always did. Lots of chatter. Sarah putting on her perfect hostess act, and the rest of the family trying to avoid stepping on any landmines. Alice arrived a little late, looking calm and composed, which only seemed to put Sarah more on edge. By the time we sat down to eat, you could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. But I stayed cool, waiting for the right moment. It came just after dessert, when everyone was relaxed and the kids were playing in the other room. I stood up, holding my wine glass, and tapped it lightly with a fork. I'd like to make a toast. I began, my voice steady and clear. The table quieted as everyone turned to look at me. I raised my glass and smiled. First, I want to thank Sarah. For everything. For the kids, for the memories, and, most importantly, for suggesting an open marriage. Sarah froze, her eyes widening as her fork clattered against her plate. I kept going. You see, it was her idea that truly opened my eyes. It made me realize what I've been missing all these years. What love, trust, and connection are supposed to feel like. I turned toward Alice, my smile softening. And it led me to you, Alice. The woman who reminded me what real love feels like. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Sarah shot up from her chair, her face pale and twisted with rage. Are you serious right now? You're thanking me for this? And her? In front of everyone. I didn't flinch. Yes, Sarah. I'm serious. You wanted freedom, and I took the opportunity to find something better. For once, I'm not apologizing for your choices. Sarah looked around the table, expecting someone to come to her defense. But the only sound was the awkward clinking of glasses and the uncomfortable shuffling of chairs. She sat back down, shaking, but I wasn't finished. I reached into the folder I had placed next to my plate and pulled out the papers I'd been waiting to deliver. Calmly, I set them in front of Sarah. These, I said, are the divorce papers. You won't use the kids as weapons anymore. I've made sure of that. Here's the deal. Sign them, or I'll fight for full custody. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I continued. We both know the court won't look kindly on your behavior. Your affairs, your neglect of the kids, your manipulation. This is the cleanest way forward for everyone. But if you want to fight, Sarah, I'll give you one. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the documents. You can't do this, she whispered. I leaned in slightly, my voice firm but not unkind. I can, and I will. This isn't about us anymore. It's about the kids. They deserve stability, and they deserve better than this toxic mess. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. She knew she didn't have a choice. Everyone in that room knew it too. Finally, with tears streaming down her face, she grabbed a pen and signed the papers. The sound of her pen scratching against the paper was the most satisfying noise I'd heard in years. When it was done, she shoved the papers back across the table and stormed out of the room without a word. I sat back down, looking at the stunned faces around the table. Well, I said, raising my glass again. To new beginnings. Alice smiled at me, her hand brushing against mine under the table. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, for all of us. After the divorce, Alice and I made our relationship official. We eventually married and built a stable, loving home. Something I hadn't realized I was missing. Sarah, on the other hand, struggled. Her reputation within the family was in tatters, and rebuilding her life proved harder than she expected. The kids, having seen too much, grew distant from her and found comfort in the steady home Alice and I provided. As for the family, they embraced Alice in her new role. Sarah's strained relationships remained, a constant reminder of the choices she'd made. When Sarah wanted an open marriage, she thought she'd gain something new. I reflect, staring at the framed family photo on the mantel. But I was the one who found someone I didn't know I needed. I found myself. I found the strength to say no to manipulation. Taking a deep breath, I smile at the sounds of laughter coming from the next room. Some stories end painfully, but that doesn't mean you can't start a new chapter. And mine is just beginning.